So as Sharon mentioned, I've been in Moscow now for, nearly 22 years continuously. So working with investment banks, and for the last 6 years with my own company, Macro Advisory. So we work with mainly big multinational companies, but half our clients are US companies, and we advise on kind of economics, politics, business conditions, and help companies with strategic decision making about what they're doing in Russia. And actually, just before I leave that, it is interesting how the approach or the attitude has changed, kind of reflecting, I think, what is generally happening in Russia. In 2014, as you, with sanctions and with the oil price collapse, of course, what we were doing was a lot of kind of, I would say, crisis management with big companies. You have the situation, even still, where companies on the ground here are making money, reporting profits back to headquarters, but people in headquarters are looking at CNN and they're freaking it. So in 2014 and 15, we were doing a lot of this kind of crossover and kind of helping to explain the real situation in Russia to headquarters and helping the local people kind of manage the changing economic conditions. That's completely changed today. We have very few conversations about, is Russia about to deteriorate or collapse, or should we be leaving, or sanctions, etc. All the conversations now are about, when do we expand? What's the timing? What should we be moving into? So a complete change of attitude on the part of big multinational companies in the last couple of years. So we can come back on that later. So what I will do, just set out, as Sharon said, a few of the kind of key points that we're looking at and that we're talking to our clients about right now, and then we can kind of delve into any one of them or in more detail with questions. Okay, the first point to make is that, as I see it, Russia is in another very significant period of change. I think that we look back in a few years, we will see these last few years as being a point when Russia again changed direction. So you can talk about this as being, say, the third major change. If you take the early 90s, of course, with everything that happened then, but also 99, 2000, 2001, with the arrival of Vladimir Putin, with the economic recovery, Russia changed direction again. And now we're in the midst of it. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill's comment about the US, Russia is a country that does the right thing when there's absolutely no other choice, and only when there's absolutely no other choice. And it sounds cynical, but it is absolutely the case, and we see it time and time again. You can tell people, even ordinary, and I don't mean in any way to be disrespectful, but God, you could tell a Russian, don't touch that because it's hot. They will have to burn their fingers before they believe you, and then they'll never do it again. And it's the same thing almost with the government. They talked for 15 years about the need to reform the economy, to kind of reduce the vulnerability to oil price volatility, etc. They did absolutely nothing about it because they didn't need to. Everything was fine. That really has changed in the last 5 or 6 years, and it has led now to a period where we can talk about Russia trying to move in a new direction. And if it works, we will have a completely different economy not today or tomorrow, but the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And I think this time, again, this would say the 4 most expensive words in the English language, it's different this time. So you're always wary about saying things are different, but there are differences. In terms of, well, what do I mean by change? Well, first of all, it is kind of an economic change, but there's also a social change. And of course, we know we're coming up to political change as well in a few years' time. But the economic change and the social change are very much linked. And you see the opinion polls and kind of the various protests, etc. People have become fed up with how long this kind of economic slump has lasted. They're completely frustrated with the deterioration in real disposable incomes and household incomes, etc. And you're starting to see that emerge in opinion polls and in kind of more open commentary. And this is brand new. We'd never had this before in Russia. In the old days, people were very tolerant. They accepted anything they were told. In the noughties, say from 2000 to 2013, Again, it didn't matter. Everybody was making money, so nobody cared about any kind of other issues, political or otherwise. Everything was fine. And then, say, from 2014 to 2017, again, people put up with the economic slowdown, deterioration, even the period of recession, because it was all blamed on Obama. It was all blamed on economic warfare. And that's one reason why the government did not get any flack for that deterioration of the economy in the early days, because it was all his fault. And Putin is defending the country, and that accounts for a big part of the reason why his popularity went up. He was defending the country in a time of almost warfare. But that's changed in the last couple of years. That message is now kind of, okay, we've heard that. That's old news. What are you doing today? And you can see that in the polls. So in terms of, why is there now this need for change? Well, first of all, or what's driving it? First of all, the old economic model was already breaking down before sanctions. And this is kind of a key point. This is not a knee-jerk reaction to sanctions or to the oil price collapse. If it was, I would not be talking about it, because we've seen so many knee-jerk reactions in the past, and they don't really amount to anything. They're kind of trotted out like a 5-year plan. It's what to say about Russia. It's so fond of making 5-year plans, it makes one every year. And and therefore you've got to be a little bit cynical. But this, I'll explain why this time there are differences. But first of all, it's important to bear in mind that oil model was already becoming less effective in 2013. In 2013, the economy grew by 1.3%. That was 1/3 of 2 years earlier, and the oil price was a steady $110 all year. So in other words, Russia was outgrowing the oil kind of income, the oil model. It was no longer creating a driver. And so by the end of that year, when we had Putin's Federal Assembly address, the State of the Nation address, as he used to do it in December, was the first time ever he had a serious comments about the need for economic change. And it reflected the fact that they could quite clearly see that oil was no longer going to drive the economy, and something else needed to be done. So that's kind of backdrop. The second issue, of course, with sanctions and the oil price, created another driver, and sanctions and an oil price combination did a couple of things. One, it kind of really hammered home the message how vulnerable Russia had become to external environment, to events outside of its control. Yes, I know you can argue that sanctions are a result of its own actions, but that's not how it's seen here. So sanctions being applied unreasonably by a foreign country leaves Russia vulnerable. Therefore, you need to become more resilient and more self-sufficient. And the oil price collapse the same. This is kind of the second oil price collapse, in a matter of 5 years. And the old Oscar Wilde quote, one price collapse is unfortunate, two looks like carelessness. And that's kind of how Putin looked at it as well. He made several comments at the time saying, we cannot continue to be vulnerable to oil price collapse, oil price volatility. We need to do something about it. So that was a factor. And then the next driver, though, is almost the most powerful, which is this change in people's attitude. The structure of the population is changing. One of the ministers we spoke to a few months ago about this, and it is the topic they talk about a lot in the administration, he referred to people as, quote, the golden monster we have created. In other words, expectations have been rising through the boom period. People are traveling. There's no censorship on the internet. There is in terms of political content or anything they deem as extremist. But you can watch CNN and you can watch BBC and etc. And so people are very well aware of what's happening in the rest of the world and how other people live, and they see that and they wanted it. So it's very basic, and this is a real fundamental change in Russia today, that more and more people want to live as others are living. They want healthcare, they want social housing, they want employment security, they want income protection. And these issues are all now very much top of the list. So it's, if you like it this way, connect the dots, okay? I talked about politics succession, but we'll come on that. But Putin clearly wants to remain in a very influential position indefinitely, but not as president. So in 2024, I certainly believe he will not look to change the constitution or do anything to remain. He will move into another position where he will be very powerful in terms of strategic decision making, geopolitics, and that's very likely to be as president of the Security Council, And in the next few years, we should see the government or legislation that gives more power, improves or increases the power of the Security Council that Putin will then move into, and reducing the power of the presidency, giving some more to the parliament. So another very similar to what Nazarbayev has done in Kazakhstan. And that way then Putin will have a very powerful, influential role, but he won't have to turn up to the office 9 to 5, which we hear he doesn't really like anymore. This kind of shaking hands and being polite to people, doesn't want to do that. But he wants to clearly control. Now, if he's going to do that, if he's going to manage that, he has to be able to show he's got strong public support. And that's really, we saw that in 2007 and 8 when he was battling internal forces, the Siloviki, people of power, there was all KGB, whatever you like. Putin had to fight them in 2007 in order to be able to have the transition or the sabbatical, as it turned out, with Dmitry Medvedev. They were very, very nervous about these kind of political maneuverings that were taking place in the Kremlin at that time. But what it came down to was Putin at that point wanted to evolve into the Tsar. And I don't think that's too contentious to say that. He sees himself as a Tsar, and therefore he wanted to have the kind of exclusive power and control of a Tsar. Whereas in 2000 to 2008, his first 2 terms, he really was chairman of the Politburo, whereas Putin wanted to become the Tsar. And essentially he did, and he regularly refers to Tsar Ivan Grozny, sort of Ivan the Terrible. And of course he was the only Tsar that voluntarily abdicated, but if we exclude Nicholas II, who had a gun to his head, but Tsar Ivan had also become frustrated with the machinations of the court and all the kind of games they were playing, and they were ignoring him. So he left, and knowing full well that they would, without a leader, they'd have to ask him back, and he came back with more power. That's exactly what Putin did. He left for 4 years, and he came back much more powerfully. And that was, so the same thing may happen again. Putin wants to have this continuing, indefinite, powerful role. He's going to likely, already we can see some evidence that other people are trying to sidetrack that or to have more influence on what happens. Putin in 2008 got away with it because he was able to show very strong public support. People wanted him to stay. He needs that. But in order to retain that support or rebuild it, it's down to the economy. So again, it's the Bill Clinton election slogan, it's the economy stupid, and that's where we're at. The economy really matters. Incomes, job security, healthcare, etc. That's what Putin needs to get right in the next few years. And that kind of, the ability therefore to recover the economy, that's the entire preoccupation today. How did he do it? And what measures will make this happen? So, that's therefore, in terms of the other driver, why is it more credible? That's a very powerful one. People are different today than they were 15 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, and are losing patience. And opinion polls, are really showing that. Now, but opinion polls in Russia are always a bit kind of skeptical as to, what's the methodology and motivation, and then quite a lot of them you can pretty much dismiss. Levada is the one we use. And that's simply, well, it's independent, but the main reason is because it has a 25-year history, and it's very transparent in how it conducts the surveys. But so we use it kind of for trend monitoring. So when they say 62% of the population say this, well, it could be 55, it could be 60, it doesn't matter. But using it in comparison, what was it a year ago? What was it 2 years ago? And what you can see is that those trends, that a growing number of people now are less interested in stability, which is has been the political mantra. Russia's stable, and look at the rest of the world. Aren't you glad you're here? And how stable it is, etc. Has been a mantra for a long time now. The last survey we saw on this, 69% of people in the 25 to 45 age group said they no longer care about stability, they want economic change. And again, these are kind of just part of what I would say is driving this motivation. So if we accept, therefore, that this is real, this whole process of how do we do it? has been ongoing for several years. In 2014-15, as I mentioned, with companies, it was really about crisis management. Day to day, what's coming down the road, we've got to deal with it. But then from about 2016, we could see the start of a more serious debate in government and with government officials about, okay, what should be the new economic model? How can we do this? And like everything in Russia, unfortunately, it just takes too long. Everything takes too long. And the whole debate, therefore, has taken years about what should be the new economic model, how should we get the growth forward. And even though, say, 2 years ago, we saw the plan or strategy which was talked about by Alexei Kudrin, the former finance minister who's now head of the audit chamber. And we say, well, that's the strategy that Putin will support. It doesn't matter. It still took 2 years before Putin endorsed it. And it's one of the kind of, we could spend all day talking about what the problems are relating to Russia are, so we won't do that. But this is definitely one of those issues, is that Putin is kind of more often than not, he's a kind of a referee in a rowdy football game rather than a dictator. He was actually asked last year at SPIEF by, I think it was Megyn Kelly, the moderator, where she accused him of kind of controlling everything. It's like as Obama, I think, said that nothing happens in Russia without Putin's say-so or approval. And unfortunately, if only that was the case, we'd be better off. But what he actually said in response to that question or accusation was, a very firm instruction can leave my office, and by the time it's reached the end of the corridor, it has become a mere suggestion. And surprising to hear it from him. But and actually Dmitry Medvedev used to say the same thing all the time. He said, people are ignoring me. I keep issuing instructions and nothing happens. And their evidence is actually, now, not on obviously main things. Putin still controls the most important things, of course. So we're not naive in that. But when it comes to other events, you still have this huge legacy from the kind of the Soviet system. There are so many people and groups who feel empowered and are empowered, whether it's the FSB or some other parts of the security forces or big companies like Rosneft or Gazprom. They do their own thing. Now, okay, they wouldn't do anything, kind of crossing the line. They're not going to invade somebody, but they'll do their own thing, and then sometimes check with Putin afterwards. And this actually is I should mention it here, one of the concerns that's beginning to kind of become obvious or being talked about as we kind of get into the latter years of Putin's kind of formal presidency. There is no doubt about it. There's a game of musical chairs taking place. There's lots of people who are fighting for a position to be well positioned when this term ends. And he wants, he wants to kind of, die as the most popular leader, and he wants a legacy. I think he's, it's in the same way as the Tsars. He wants to be remembered in history as the person who changed Russia. And so I don't think, in terms of, I'm scrambling a little bit to give you a better answer, because I don't think that there's any specific agenda. In other words, for example, I've never believed, or there's zero evidence that Putin is a wealthy individual, even though I know it's widely talked about that he's very extremely rich, but there's zero evidence of that. He lives as a Tsar lives. In other words, he uses the country's resources. He has the state house, the state jets, the cars, etc. He never spends a single dime. And the way his family live also is consistent with that. His daughter was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in The Hague for years until she had to leave after the Malaysian aircraft was destroyed. But again, they're not driving around Harrods and doing wheelies and Ferraris, etc., as Arab kids are. And he doesn't need the money, because as a Tsar, he has full resources of the state. And also critically, and I guess where maybe observers who are looking at this and accuse him of, it's because they see all the people around him, with billions of dollars. And these expensive houses and lifestyles, etc. So QED, he must have more than them, is a kind of a bit of the argument. And that's not how the Tsar operates. If you remember, the Tsar allows people around him to make money. He grants them the ability to make money. Therefore, they owe him. Their wealth, their position is dependent on him, allowing them to have it and to keep it. And that's what we've had a lot of that. And the people who kind of who have left Russia and say, oh, I know for sure he's got money. Well, a lot of them left, money, or left Russia, kind of, shall we say, under suspicious circumstances. The two individuals that were quoted in the Treasury Department report as being credible witnesses saying to Putin that all this wealth, they both left money having destroyed the banks that they managed. And they ended up in I think both cases in the UK with enough money to buy $50 million houses. Now, unless some of them waves a winning lottery ticket, you can be suspicious as to where it came from. So in other words, they've got an agenda. And that's not to mean to sidetrack. But, so Putin sees himself as a Tsar, and I say, I don't think it's really about, Russia's place in the world and maintaining it. He doesn't have a plan. There's certain convictions, and this is where it falls down, regularly run into these problems. Now, around him is different. You're absolutely right. That's an issue, and that's why the next couple of years, as these groups position for life after, formal Putin's rule, then we might get some nasties. There could very well be kind of more kind of infighting and fighting. We see it now, the FSB. 15 senior FSB people have been arrested since the start of this year as part of this cult, this internal battle. And these things are dangerous, and because you don't know what's going to happen next. And Putin has been very quiet. I think it's because he's vulnerable. And actually, that's one interesting point. He is vulnerable right now because they say his core support base people are now not happy with him. I mean, forget the approval rating, because the leader of the nation always has a strong approval rating because there's nobody else. So there were tears at Stalin's funeral, for God's sake. So you always support the national leader, and then the next one, whoever it happens to be. So forget that. But it's the other polls, the ones, do you trust him to do a good job? These sort of polls, they've all massively deteriorated down to kind of historic low levels, and that must be leaving him vulnerable. It's positive in the sense it means that he's got to push for the economic recovery, but it leaves him vulnerable, and maybe it's one reason why he's now relatively quiet, and you see these other groups more openly fighting for their position and fighting other groups, and he's not interfering. So maybe when the economy recovers and opinion polls improve, you might see him being more assertive. But he looks quite vulnerable today. In general, I would say the attitude to Western companies is positive or benign. I mean, occasionally, you'd say, particularly when some sanctions issue happened. In 2014, of course, was the case in point, when the sanctions were applied, and of course in the Duma and amongst nationalists, it was like, let's kick out the American companies, kind of as a knee-jerk reaction. But, it fairly quickly kind of went away. We had the same thing in 1999. People like to blame external factors for economic crisis. And in 1999 was actually a little bit dangerous because, it was a different environment back then. People were generally poor, they were very angry, and foreigners were a target for a bit, particularly if you were an American. And because I took to wearing my Irish T-shirt as a safety net. But anyway, that kind of very quickly passed off. In 2014, it's the same. In fact, the government's position is, in fact, Putin has stated it very clearly. He said, we are not going to do anything to make it any more difficult for foreign companies to work in Russia. This was in response to, we should have some counter-sanctions. And with the exception of that food ban, there has been no Russian counter measures or reaction to any of the increasing sanctions, because they need the money and they want the expertise as much as... In fact, that was one of Putin's kind of epiphanies, or his convictions, that twice we can see that Putin did a 180-degree turn on previous convictions. One was in relation to the ruble. Up to the spring of 2015, Putin was an advocate of a strong ruble, constantly referring to the strong ruble as an indicator of well-being. Look how well we're doing, look how well our currency is doing. But in spring of 2015, essentially the country was going broke because of the oil price decline and sanctions, etc. And so it was pointed out to him, like, you've got to let the ruble weaken, otherwise we won't, we'll run out of money. So reluctantly he had to do it, say when there's no other choice, had to do it, didn't want to, but within months could see the evidence of the benefits of a weak currency in terms of budget management, the competitive environment. Agriculture, of course, in particular, got an enormous boost from the weak ruble as well as the sanctions, so that now, in the last couple of years, Russia is the world's biggest wheat exporter. And in other areas, it's now a net exporter of, say, poultry, whereas, of course, in the 90s, there was forever rows over importing how much US chicken was being imported. Now Russia's exporting. So he's a complete advocate of a weak ruble. And government policy today is that the ruble should remain in the mid-60s against the dollar indefinitely, regardless of the oil price, regardless of economic conditions. So you get some volatility around it, but it'll always come back to the mid-60s and for the next several years, because they see that as a key driver of competitiveness. The other one, though, the conviction was up to the spring of 2009, Putin was in favor of very slow WTO negotiations and access, because his position was Russian companies needed more time to become competitive and efficient to be able to deal with Western companies. In the spring of 2009, when 150,000 auto sector workers hit the streets in Togliatti complaining about not being paid, and by Friday they were complaining about the lack of political leadership, and again Putin went there directly and addressed it head on and fixed it. But from that day, his speeches are, we need more foreign companies to come in, because that's how Russian companies will benefit from peer group experience, from working with foreign companies, etc. Complete advocate of bringing, in some sectors there are limits. So there are like for example on subsoil or oil and gas, there's a maximum of either 25 or 49% that a foreigner can own. Other industries, there are no limits, but he's a complete kind of open door. And say in 2014, when there was all these demands to kick out McDonald's and Pepsi, etc., all of them, after a period of time, they were all killed. All these proposals were told to stop. So it's a long-winded way to answer your question. It doesn't arise in Russia yet. There's no animosity towards Western companies, be they US or anything else. In general, actually, it's quite the opposite. If ever a Western company, particularly a US company, makes an announcement of some expansion, that's almost headline news. And the government uses that as an indicator of, look, we're attracting more investment, things are going to get better. So they like that. It's quite the opposite. But there are no environmental issues. I mean, the environmental issues are more to do with government failures and the lack of dealing with problems. That really is the problem. Yeah.
How do these large state-owned banks leverage their capital to help finance these very ambitious, expensive projects?
Sure. The question of funding the national projects is one I should have addressed, because I said it's 400 billion, and there is this kind of big debate about where's the money going to come from. In theory, half the money should come from the state, and the other half should come from investment, whether it's foreign or private investment. So right now there's a big debate between the central bank, finance ministry and others over the use of the sovereign wealth fund. We talk about poor economic conditions, but Russia's balance sheet is in great shape. It's got the 6th lowest level of national debt in the world, now the 5th highest financial reserves, $200 billion trade surplus last year, 130 billion current account surplus, a $44 billion budget surplus last year, 30 billion on target for this year. So financially it's in great shape. It's just how to use that to create growth. So the sovereign wealth fund is now at $130 billion. The target is to get that to 140 and then keep that as a rainy day reserve, and then start spending the surplus after that. So the assumption is that the budget surplus will continue, and from now on the surplus will go into funding national projects, because you've already built the 140 billion reserve that you want to keep for stability. But say there's a big debate now about that 140 billion is too much. We don't need that. The economy actually needs some stimulus. It needs some spending today to get, to pull out of this kind of a slump that's in. So it's quite likely we might see that policy change later in the year. They might bring down the sovereign wealth fund limit to 100 billion, and then start spending the 30 or 40 billion that's there already. So long as the oil price is at $60 or better, then the government should be able to fund its share of national projects. If the oil price comes down to 40 something, they've got a problem, particularly if US Congress follows through on its threat to put a block on US investors buying Russian sovereign debt. This is kind of one of those proposals that's now floating around in the DASCA bill. That won't matter today because the budget's in surplus and Russia doesn't need the money, but it will be a problem in the future, if oil comes down, but in any case it'll be a problem because you need to regularly issue debt in order to maintain your risk assessment or the risk rating, and that's important for big corporations as well. So that's one provision that everybody's hoping will be taken out of any revisions to DASCA before it's passed, which we assume it will. So funding national projects shouldn't be an issue so long as the oil price stays high, but it will be an issue if it comes down. And then private investment, again, they're targeting that. And this is where the banks will come in. Sorry, I was just going to think of the question. This is where, yeah, we will get the banks. Now, the banks, the state controls about 75% of the banking system. And it's likely to go up because there will be more mergers in the mid-tier banks, more rescues, etc. And then this is kind of part of a long-term strategy. When I came to Russia 22 years ago, Russia had 1,250 licensed banks. And this was apart from the 90s. You could get a banking license if you had $100,000. And every big company had their own bank because they didn't trust anybody else with their money. So they had to, hence all these banks. So for years, Putin, again, it's another one of these measures. Putin has been calling for Russia only needs 200 banks rather than 1,200, and nothing happened for years. In fact, one deputy chairman was quite active, and he was shot, assassinated. It was a long time ago, but so the whole thing stopped. But because of 2009 and because of the economic crisis that affected Russia as well as globally, it had to be done. So Putin appointed Elvira Nabiullina as governor, and she's been very effective with Putin's support. So today Russia has about 350 banks, so we're well down, but her target is to get rid of at least another 100, and to do that by merging banks and by also forcing banks out. They're increasing the capital requirements, capital adequacy requirements, etc. So it'll require the owners of these banks to put more money in, and quite a lot of them won't have it or won't be willing to do it. So they'll probably drop their license that way, as well as kind of emerging. The way the banks are operated on, Sberbank is always separated from everybody else. And this was also something that we had from very early on from Putin. Again, kind of coming in after the 98, 99 crisis, he made very clear that Sberbank would never be allowed get involved in speculative lending or political lending. In other words, the Sberbank was to behave as a normal bank because he understood that this was necessary for maintaining kind of social stability. People needed to be able to rely on one bank, that it wouldn't walk away or go bust or steal their money. And that has always been Sberbank. And therefore Sberbank has never been involved in lending to big, kind of speculative projects or to Putin's friends or the oligarchs. It was partly, of course, lending on the building of the Sochi Olympics, but that was kind of to the state rather than to individuals or to developers. So they're never been allowed to do that because it's too critical for economic and social stability. The other banks are every week. The VTB is of course almost like the nominated bank. If any oligarch needs to be bailed out, or any friend of Putin needs to be bailed out, or any state company needs to be bailed out, it's VTB that will give them the money. I mean, if there was a proper audit of its balance sheet, a proper risk assessment, the bank is probably bust. But you won't get that. I mean, that's and anyway, state bank. Gazprom Bank, the same, the Agriculture Bank, they're all, and VEB, Veneshchenko Bank, they're all used to either support powerful individuals, Putin's friends, or state companies, or bail out inefficient industries that should long ago have been allowed to go out of business. The money is still coming through those banks. How they raise the money, again, they borrow it from the central bank reserves. The central bank reserves today are about 550 billion, 100 billion of that is in gold, the rest is in cash. Probably 2/3 of that is already lent to the state banks. So yes, if you kind of pull back the shroud and you think, this is actually a bit scary, because you say, okay, you've got 500 billion, but where is it? Mr. Rottenberg has 50 million of it, and Mr. Sechin has another 50 million, so you don't want to scratch the surface, and hence, that's why it's really important that somebody like Putin is in the middle maintaining stability, because if you were to take him out of it, and you were to get this kind of more open warfare, these sort of lending and cross supports would be completely exposed, and then the whole edifice could come crashing down. So they've built this kind of fragile structure that he now has to stay to kind of maintain, because we are far from being a kind of robust system. It might happen in 10 years' time if the national projects work, but and then just final point on that, sanctions. I should mention that okay, so my position is on sanctions is quite clear. In 2014, sanctions were very positive for Russia because it forced them into taking actions that they would otherwise continue to avoid. So the budget reform was on the back of sanctions plus oil price. So the budget today will balance at just about $45, $46 per barrel of oil. In 2013, it needed $115 to balance. So the ruble collapse plus budget reform kind of has done that. Today, Russia is much less vulnerable to oil price volatility than, say, Saudi Arabia is or Russia used to be. That's a consequence of sanctions. And the other national projects, other kind of reforms we've had, all in the back of sanctions plus oil. And you have to really look at both together. You can't say sanctions did this, oil did that, because they happened at exactly the same time. And the options, therefore, the government had were restricted because of both events rather than any one particular. So the 2014 sanctions were used positively. The agriculture sector, exports have all come on the back of that. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. Russia would have simply have borrowed more money and just maintained inefficient budget spending for longer. But the current sanctions, and particularly those from the CATSA legislation that was signed in August 17, that was a game changer. If you recall, what that legislation did was it took control of sanctions out of the executive branch and into Congress. So Congress now has control over sanctions, not the president. And the second thing is it introduced secondary sanctions threat. So any foreign person or company who takes advantage of US sanctions can themselves be sanctioned, like the Iranian style. That's been a game changer. The effect of that is we saw a big drop in inward investment. And it's still quite sluggish. So it explains why Putin is completely opposed to any retaliatory actions, because say he's not going to make it any more difficult for foreign investors. They need the money, and they will need to attract 100 to 150 billion of private investment into national projects over the next 5 years. And it's not just national projects. You say that's the core of it, but there are other parallel programs. There's a $36 billion power sector rejuvenation program, which is separate. There is a $26 billion digitalization program, which is separate. There are quite a number of other programs. So in total, the total kind of spending program is up to about 700 or 800 billion. And more than half of that will have to come from private companies. And therefore, Russia can't afford to make it more difficult. And hence so the position right now is everybody expects more sanctions to come in the next couple of months once Congress comes back. Probably a bundling of some of the various bills that are now out there. But they're hoping that it will not include the ban on investing in Russian sovereign debt. And also there's one other dangerous provision which would limit the amount of investment in the Russian oil sector to $1 million per project. I mean, that industry, you can't buy paper clips for that. So they're assuming, actually that one is likely to get taken out anyway, because one of the oil companies told me that every time something like this goes in, they go to Congress and they say, if you do that, then it will block US companies or European companies from investing in the Russian sector, fine, which is what you want, but it will then completely open the door for the Chinese to come in and replace us. And all you're doing is enhancing China's long-term energy security. And is that what you want? And then that usually kills it straight away. So, so sanctions anyway, but they're hoping that this next round of sanctions will be the last, and then we can kind of move forward next year and rebuild.
Small business. In 2002, Mr. Putin said that he wanted to increase small business opportunities. How is that progressing?
Hasn't. hasn't still talking about it, unfortunately, still promising. There are a number of measures that look credible. One, for example, and again, it shows you that when you get to the point you have to do something to do it, but not until then. For years, the business community has been complaining to Putin directly and to the government generally about the level of kind of bureaucracy, inspections, and this is a big source of corruption. Now, if you're McDonald's or ExxonMobil, you're not going to be shaken down at the main office. Nobody's going to come and shake you down and ask for corruption. But out in the field or out in the, in the real economy, it's these inspections are irritating, are time-consuming, and are a source of corruption. For example, it's not taking any secrets, but a well-known fast food chain, say what happens with them is the inspector will arrive. He'll open the cold store, and the temperature should be a certain. And it is, and then he puts his foot in the door for 10 minutes and then does it again and say, oh, it's too high, I'm going to write you up unless you pay me. And this is as blatant as that. So people have been complaining about this for years, and Putin has been promising to reduce it, but absolutely nothing has happened. Again, consistent with just because he says to do it, it doesn't happen. Thank you. So instead, what he's now, out of sheer frustration a few months ago, he said, forget about reducing it. On the 1st of January 2020, it will all end. It's called the regulatory guillotine. So all inspections will end on that date, and because it wasn't happening otherwise. Now, we have to wait and see, but that's, again, that's a positive action. The second complaint from small businesses, they cannot get access to money at affordable rates. So if you're a Rosneft and you go to the bank, you borrow money at 8%. If you're a small business and you go to the bank, they probably want 15 to 20%. So again, economic conditions don't justify that level of borrowing. And just anecdotally, our office is up behind the Lubyanka. So, and if you know Moscow, that street that runs between the Lubyanka and, say, the Lukoil headquarters. And you can see, real life on that street, the number of small shops that are closing and have been closing for the last year. And then it's all across the city. It's small businesses are under pressure. So it's an aspiration they're talking about. They know it has to happen. Absolutely nothing has been done. So we'll wait and see. At least from looking at opinion polls and talking to people in Washington, etc., as you say, the view of Russia really couldn't be much worse. Although what I'm told, and again, this is just my observation, is that it's very much kind of, on the coasts in New York and Washington, people in the what you refer to as flyover country, or in the rest of the heartland. Yeah, people are much less concerned about Russia or etc. But maybe as case, I guess just this relentless news coverage about how bad Russia is. It clearly has had the impact. In Russia, that's not the case. Opinion polls showed that people believe that relations are bad, but they also showed that people don't have any worse feelings about America than they ever had. It's like, well, we know that relations are bad, we understand that, but so what? It's not a case of, we kind of moved on from that. In 2014, it was absolutely, President Obama was the most evil person in the world because he's attacking us, and President Putin is defending us. That was because that's what was being trumped out on the media every night. Actually, that's one interesting point. What's also changing, and again, things in Russia change for different reasons, but up to recently, Russian people got their news or their opinions from the mainstream media, TV and newspapers, and therefore they're all state-controlled. One of the reasons why Yandex and other internet companies are now come under attack is because it's switched. More than half the people now get their daily news from the internet. And the government is now completely freaking on that, and they're trying to figure out how they can control it and control those companies, etc. So it's kind of interesting also kind of change as the country modernizes, as people's attitudes change, etc. But, what to do about it? Okay, first of all, the context here is that in 2014, you heard a lot about the Asia pivot. Remember, it was like, okay, the US has rejected us, we're going to China. Thankfully, the Chinese weren't that interested. And there is certainly a strong relationship on energy, and that's getting bigger and bigger. And when you see the numbers, to say, oh, trade between Russia and China has gone up from this to this to this, it's almost all energy. China's put a lot of money into Russian energy, whether it's pipelines or oil projects or the big gas project in Yamal, and refineries in the Far East. So it suits China. China's game, I suppose, is it wants this energy security. And I've heard this from a number of Chinese officials as well, that at some point they fear a conflict with the US could lead to some sort of a blockage of energy, maybe ships, etc. So they are putting a massive amount of money into building overland supply lines from Central Asia, from Russia. The big gas pipeline will open next year, early next year, the Power of Siberia gas pipeline. And the whole Belt and Road system is all about China creating an inland, more secure trade route and supply route in case their harbors are blocked by the US Navy. And a lot of it is to that. So that's the kind of the Russia relationship. But it didn't work in the way that maybe some nationalists did. German Greff had a great quote to kind of really summed it up. At the end of that year, he led a delegation of banks to China for funding. And he came back, he said, we were in a long line of people looking for money and nobody called us to the top of the queue. So it's kind of like, that's a reality check right there. And that also invigorated the whole debate about national projects and self-sufficiency. It's also led to a change in Russia's geopolitical position. Today, that geopolitical position is diversification. I think incorrectly, Putin always refers to Russia's mistake of having been too close to the West. Well, that's kind of good politics to say that. But today, it's diversification. So it's the reason why Russia did the deal with the Saudis for the OPEC deal, wanted to rebuild that relationship in the Middle East, which it has done. You see now the Far East Economic Forum is taking place today, tomorrow in Vladivostok. So the Chinese are there in big numbers, but the Japanese and the Koreans are there in just as big numbers. The biggest buyer of Russian weapons today is India, followed by Vietnam, followed by Indonesia. So, all across. And the next move, you can already see it, the big priority for Russia is rebuilding relations with Europe. And so a key part of that will be obviously what will happen with Ukraine between now and the end of the year. And the event to watch is, well, okay, the prisoner swap, which is now expected imminently, but the key one will be the gas contract. The current transit gas contract expires at the end of this year. It needs to be renewed. And right now that looks difficult, but it'll have to happen. So that could be a catalyst for some pragmatism. I wouldn't say normality, that's never going to happen, but more pragmatism. And that then would allow Russia to rebuild with Europe, which is its main target. And hence, just recently, Putin was with Macron in Paris, and that's part of that. And of course, it suits Macron as well because he sees himself as the global savior in the midst of all this craziness, and with Brexit and with the trade wars and etc. He wants, and with Merkel leaving as well. The opportunity has arrived. So what to do about it? Look, I think what you guys are doing is obviously a key part of it, is just kind of the greater awareness. It's and talking about it, but the opposition is formidable. And again, I don't want to be kind of political about it, but the position from the editorial of the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the Financial Times, whatever, is just the narrative is anti-Russia. And even sometimes when I talk to journalists here and give some quotes or whatever information, and the article comes out and it's negative, and I say, oh, you should have used that because the context is wrong. And he said, I did, but the editor took it out. He wanted the story to be more negative. And we hear that all the time from journalists. So I'm afraid I think we're just going to have to suck it up until the end of Putin and Trump's terms in office. And it's not going to really be much better. I suppose what you hope is that there are no incidents, no more Syria's chemical attack, no more whatever, and they kind of just kind of drift, kind of stay estranged, as it were, rather than fully divorced. And then after there's two new leaders in the Kremlin and the White House in 2025, then you might start sitting down and be a little bit more. So I think really the damage is so extensive, it's more a case of we're just going to have to ride this out for 3 or 4 more years and then hope that it'll start to rebuild after that. But I don't see anything that could do it in the meantime, because Russia will be unwilling to do. Putin would never do anything that would be a sign of capitulation, or which is clearly what Congress would probably want. Never do that. And the U.S. obviously Congress is not going to lighten up, because that's just not their nature. So as I say, I think we're just going to have to suck it up for 3 or 4 years and then hope the next two leaders will have a more pragmatic relationship. I'm assuming that Trump gets re-elected, so that's a different. So I don't know. So maybe if there is a new leader, I guess then it might happen quicker. But I can't see it under Trump, and more because of his conflict with Congress, rather than not necessarily with Russia. But Russia is a very useful stick to beat Trump with, as far as I can see, with Congress. So long as he stays, that Russia will be in the frame and the accusations will always stay, and therefore you cannot rebuild. So if he's gone in January 2021, then you have a better chance of being more pragmatic. And in fact, even back in the day before the election, I was amazed with all these comments about, that Russia was happy with Trump. Yeah, the nationals were the stupid people, but people in government that we talked to before the election, they were horrified with the prospect. I remember the Deputy Prime Minister at the time saying to me, he said, you don't know what Donald Trump would have done during the Crimea referendum. You know exactly what Hillary Clinton would have done, which is what Obama did, and it was all predictable. So they saw, even before the election, the people in the administration, the foreign ministry, were actually fearful of Trump because of his unpredictability, and they've been absolutely proven right since. So you did get all of that, the Duma guys, the Nationals is great, and Russia Today, absolute nonsense. The people in government were horrified, and well before it. So